Donald Trump has said that he loves the word tariffs. It's a beautiful word, and he thinks it'll be unilaterally beneficial. It's not a bluff. It's not a threat. It's just something that he thinks is intrinsically good. And I think that if it ends up being taken off the table in response to changes that are made overseas, the implications of that will be very different.
Self-censorship is the decision a person makes not to express themselves fully and accurately in public on questions that are controversial out of a concern that inferences will be drawn about them by an audience from their willingness to say certain things, to oppose affirmative action, to criticize the Israeli Defense Forces' conduct of a war in Gaza, to have doubts about the gender debate and whether or not transgender advocacy is appropriate. There are many, many controversial issues, of course, on which people don't feel entirely comfortable expressing their true views, in which they're cautious and which they may remain silent and not say what they really think, or they may temper their expression of their views in anticipation of the reaction of the audience. Hello, everyone. This is Glenn Loury, and you are listening or watching or both The Glenn Show. I'm a professor at Brown University, and my guest this week is Rajiv Sethi, who is an economist. He's a professor at Barnard College, Columbia University, and an old friend, colleague, and co-author of mine. So welcome to The Glenn Show, Rajiv.
Thank you, Glenn.
Rajiv is also the author of a newsletter at Substack called Imperfect Information, which is a fascinating, wide-ranging, and very thoughtful commentary on public policy issues from an information economist and game theorist perspective. I highly recommend it to anyone with interest in that general area. And recently had a post in which he made fascinating connections between the subjects of self-censorship and of identity passing. And I wanted to talk, this is something that has interested me for many, many years, and I wanted to talk with Rajiv about that and related matters. So you want to tell us a little bit, Rajiv, about what you're after in that discussion?
Sure, Glenn. So we have discussed your work on self-censorship in public discourse on many occasions before, including on blogging heads and so on. And I was really struck by this book that's forthcoming later this year on self-censorship, which republishes your 1994 essay, along with a new foreword and afterword. And the afterword deals with current events, especially in Israel and Gaza. And so I wrote something about that, and it occurred to me while I was writing it that self-censorship is a kind of passing, in the sense that the perception that other people hold about you differs from your internal mental life, and that can create a certain tension. And you described in your afterword that this could lead to a loss of self-respect and a feeling of shame. And I connected this to the book by James Weldon Johnson, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, published anonymously in 1912, and then acknowledged in 1927, I believe. And that's exactly how the book ends. The book ends with some sort of wistful imagining of what life might have been like had he chosen not to pass.
I should explain. Ian Malcolmson, he's known to you, is he not?
Ian Malcolm, yeah.
Ian Malcolm, I beg your pardon. He is the editor at Polity Books, a UK-based publishing house, who contacted me a year ago, suggesting that an essay that I published originally in 1994 on self-censorship and public discourse, a theory of political correctness, might be worth reprinting, appropriately modified or framed for a current audience, because it remained relevant and it was, he thought, so profound. So I say in all modesty, that's what you're referring to. Self-censorship is the decision a person makes not to express themselves fully and accurately in public on questions that are controversial out of a concern that inferences will be drawn about them by an audience from their willingness to say certain things, to oppose affirmative action, to criticize the Israeli Defense Forces' conduct of a war in Gaza, to have doubts about the gender debate and whether or not transgender advocacy is appropriate, etc. There are many, many controversial issues, of course, on which people don't feel entirely comfortable expressing their true views, in which they're cautious and which they may remain silent and not say what they really think, or they may temper their expression of their views in anticipation of the reaction of the audience, this kind of phenomenon. And I analyze through an exploration of case studies and through a use of some ideas from information economics, although it's not a technical argument. I analyze this phenomenon in the original context of the 1990s. The public debates about so-called political correctness were all the rage. We talk now about cancel culture and about the woke and all of that, but the analytical insights, such as they were, I think, remain applicable, and even though we live in a different time. So that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, exactly. So Ian Malcolm was previously at Harvard University Press, and he was the editor of my book with Dan O'Flaherty. And then he moved to Polity, and he discovered your essay through our own conversation maybe 10 years ago. And what's interesting is that at the time of that conversation, this was on Blogging Heads, you were using a landline. We were recording audio and video separately.
Yes, I remember, and sending it in to the Blogging Heads webmaster, who would fashion a Talking Heads format such as what you are in this audience experiencing right now. But it was done by hand. There were no apps
stitched together. Yeah. So that was so Ian Malcolm saw that. And it was through that conversation that he discovered the essay. And so he, partly for that reason, I think he asked me to write a blurb for the book because he knew that I've studied that several times. I've used it in class and so on. So yes, I'm familiar with Ian.
Yeah. The connection between self-censorship and passing. So the person whose racial identity is ambiguous from just looking at them can allow people to think what they will. They may think that the individual in question is not Black when in fact that person is. Or the person may want to be thought of as being Black when in fact the casual observer might not come to that conclusion on his own. The disjunction between what a person thinks about themselves and what a casual observer will be led to think about them from their self-presentation becomes the context or the circumstance in which various kinds of dilemmas and interesting problems arise, and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, in fact, and it just occurred to me that you have a relatively recent paper that deals with exactly this issue. The paper with Youngchal Kim, To Be or Not to Be. I think it's in Journal of Public Economics, and that's about selective passing, about who might choose a different identity when they have a choice, and how that might affect, investments in human capital, in education, and so on. So you've looked at this analytically as well.
Oh, well, thanks for mentioning that paper. I'm afraid it hasn't gotten so much traction in the citation indices and so on, but
it will eventually. Like your essay is of as great interest right now as when it was first written. It's about 30 years ago, so some things take a while to get noticed.
Yeah. So, what are you working on these days, Rajiv?
So, Glenn, the last time we spoke, we talked about prediction markets.
Yes, indeed. I remember.
And that was before the election. And right after the election, there was a bit of a triumphalist discourse about these markets, that they had outdone the statistical models and so on in predicting a victory by Donald Trump. And that was based on just the headline market, the likelihood of who would be elected president. And that's a bit premature because we have lots and lots of markets and congressional elections for the popular vote, for particular state outcomes, and so on. And there's certainly some races for which the markets got it wrong relative to the models, at least in terms of the ranking of the probabilities. And so what I'm doing is just doing a comprehensive analysis of forecasting performance, models versus markets. So that's something that will be done and posted quite soon. I have a deadline of March for a conference submission. And the other thing, very briefly, I'll mention, which because I'm really quite proud of it and really interested in it, is a paper that I just posted on educational standards and parental investment. And this relates also to some of the work we have done together and your work going back to your dissertation. And this is motivated by what happened in California with the changes in standards. So with regard to 8th grade algebra in San Francisco, and then changes in the state requirements as well. And basically, some of this backfired. It was motivated by equalizing outcomes. But of course, it didn't take into account how parents would respond to changes in the standards. And so this paper, it's just called, I think it's called Educational Standards and Parental Investment. I just posted it a few days ago. This is with Jyotana Dasgupta, who's at an institution in Delhi. And we just theoretically try to explore what happens when students are heterogeneous along two dimensions, their preparation or capacity to learn, and parental wealth and the amount that the parents could invest in their learning. And once you take these two things into account, there are some complexities that arise when you change educational standards. And if you don't take those into account, your policy initiatives can backfire, can lead to unanticipated outcomes. So those are the two things. Yeah.
I'm very interested in this. What was the practical example in, you say, California?
It was initially in San Francisco, and
the change of standards. What does that mean? I mean,
it was a delay. So one example is a delay until 9th grade before the introduction of algebra. So 8th grade algebra was pushed into 9, with the goal of sort of equalizing performance, preparing students better in order for them to succeed.
Demographic groups?
That was certainly part of it. Yeah.
Some groups are lagging behind, and by delaying the introduction of this more technically demanding subject, they would have a chance to catch up.
That was the reasoning. Yeah.
And what's the mechanism again involving parents and their decisions about investing in their children?
Well, if parents have different capacities or different inclinations, they can undo some of this. The students can become better prepared through non-school inputs. And so that's going to change the level of preparation that they have when they enter 9th grade. So if one doesn't take that into account, it's going to have a different impact. But there are lots of other things that can happen. One of the results in the paper that I just mentioned is that low standards can be worse than no standards when it comes to performance, academic performance. And part of the reason for that is in the absence of standards, you're going to have some level of parental investment, you're going to have some level of child effort, and you're going to have some level of performance. And if a parent dramatically reduces their investment, they're going to dramatically reduce performance. But if you have a low standard, maybe somewhat lower than the performance that's being attained currently, substantial reduction in investment can give you less of a reduction in performance because the standard acts as a floor. You go down to the standard and you know that you won't go below it. And so when parents are heterogeneous with regard to their preferences and with regard to their income and wealth, you can get certain things happening that are not intuitive, and that can't happen if the capacity to learn or the preparation of students was exogenously given, independent of parental inputs. So we're trying to explore this theoretically. The empirical relevance will be looked at later, probably by people who have better expertise in the data work.
Now,
But
again, I want to understand the idea of the standard is that it's a payoff that's a 0-1. If you meet the standard, you get the benefit regardless of how much you might exceed.
That's right. So getting into the details, if you'd like, of the model, you care about your performance, and you also care about whether you pass the standard. That's right. So there's an extra incentive, and if you ignore parental inputs, then a standard can only raise performance. It'll leave it unchanged or raise it. But if you take parental inputs into account, a low standard can actually lower performance.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's a theoretical, it's applied theory. So it's just trying to look at the logic of these various interacting components. And it's motivated by the California case, but I don't want to make a claim that it has direct empirical application.
Now, you say these papers are going to be posted. Does that mean that you're not submitting them for evaluation at refereed journals and so on?
Oh, they will eventually. But right now, I've just submitted it to conferences. So there's the Econometric Society World Conference in Seoul, South Korea.
Yeah.
In August. There's also the THREAD conference, the Theoretical Research in Development, in Italy at some point. And I want feedback from people who know more than me. And at that point, I'll submit to a journal. At the moment, it's in a working paper repository, SSRN.
On the prediction markets work. So you say the contracts that were merely assessing who would win the election tended to anticipate Trump's victory more effectively than polling data prior to the election was able to do?
So you can't compare it to polling data because polling data is not a probability. But polling data is an input into statistical models, such as that by The Economist 538 and Nate Silver Bulletin. So these models take polling data and other kinds of data like economic fundamentals, and they churn out daily forecasts in the form of a probability of election. And on the eve of the election, the models had essentially converged to a toss-up, about a 50% chance. There's a little bit of variation across models. But if you look at the 90 days since Harris secured the nomination, there's about 3 months between the official nomination and the election. And so there are daily forecasts by the models and high-frequency forecasts by the prediction markets, which can change in seconds, every second. But if we look at daily forecasts by the markets, maybe synchronized with the timing of the publication of the model forecasts, you then have probabilities by these two different forecasting mechanisms on a daily basis. And one can either adopt conventional approaches to forecasting accuracy, like a mean squared error, a Brier score. Or you can do what I have been proposing, which is a profitability test. So if you believe the model and you trade based on it on the market, using the market prices, will you make money or lose money? And you can do this, if you do this for the headline market, that is the presidential winner in the Electoral College, you would have lost money if you had bet based on each of the three models. In that sense, the markets did better, right? It was not possible for the models to be used to beat the markets. This won't surprise financial market participants, but in 2020, I had found that the models actually did do better. But on the headline market, that's just a single event. Even though you've got 90 different forecasts, they're all referencing the exact same event. So really to have a comprehensive analysis of forecasting performance, you need to look at multiple races. For example, the Senate, the House, and the individual states, like who would win Michigan, who would win Georgia, and so on.
Something I'm missing here, if people can trade based on the models, why isn't that already reflected in the markets?
It is. And in principle, the market price could be reflected in the models. They don't actually do this, but you could build a model that has the market price itself as an input. So they each could reference each other. But as long as they disagree, right, as long as they have not generating the exact same forecast, you can still ask the question as to whether which one performs better.
So what do you have to say about the apparent superiority of the market?
It's apparent, firstly. it's only based on one event. And once I've done the analysis for the rest of the contracts, I'll know whether that apparent superiority applies more generally.
I somehow remember you talking in one of your posts about manipulation of the market by interested parties prior to the election.
Yeah, so when we last spoke, we talked about the pros and cons. So markets can take into account any sorts of information. Models are tied down. They can only use what has historically been shown to be relevant, including polling data, of course. But, there are other things, subtle things about candidate quality, maybe gaffes, maybe scandals, all kinds of things could happen that affect the likelihood of an election outcome, which would not be reflected in opinion polls or may at least be reflected after some time. And so the markets are superior in that respect. They can take into account novel sources of information, and they can also take into account information very quickly. But they also can sometimes overreact. They're sometimes excessively volatile. This is something that has been shown by Bob Shiller, even for conventional financial markets. Things like the tech bubble, other kinds of run-ups in prices that were not justified by fundamentals. So you do get bubbles and crashes.
This is Robert Shiller, the Yale economist and Nobel Prize recipient.
Exactly.
His hypothesis about excess volatility is one of the things cited in his...
Yeah, it's foundational work, along with the paper by Leroy and Porter in the 1970s that argued that prices were much more volatile than underlying fundamentals would warrant. This is all debated, of course, but that's a potential weakness of markets. And so the question as to which of these approaches to forecasting is superior is an empirical question. You can't answer it logically. That was the point that I was making when we last spoke. And so now I'm trying to conduct the empirical exercise.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, we're talking about elections and economics. What do you make of this epic event of the reemergence of Donald Trump and the Republican solid control of the federal government and so on? Are you worried about economic policy going forward?
I'm curious as to what will happen. I'm not sure whether certain announced policies, like with regard to tariffs, are going to end up being negotiating tactics that lead to concessions, both economic and non-economic, by trading partners, or whether they will actually be implemented and possibly retaliated against. Because those two things are going to give rise to very different scenarios. There's an interesting finding that was reported by someone on social media. I forget the source now. But there seems to be a stock market reaction in our trading partners. There's a decline in stock prices, and particularly those prices that attach to firms that would be hurt by tariffs, particularly hurt.
This in Europe and Asia?
Europe and Asia, yes, and Latin America, yeah. However, Canada also. However, there isn't much of a reaction in US markets, either in the aggregate or with regard to the differential between those that are vulnerable to a trade war versus those that are not. And so if I were to interpret this, I would say that what the markets are saying, and bear in mind what we just said about the possible rationality of markets, but what the markets seem to be saying is that the tariff threat will lead to concessions by trading partners that might impose costs on them, but will not hurt the US economy. So that's one possibility. I don't know.
Let me see if I understand that. The value of the shares of companies in Europe and Asia who are exposed because a lot of their business depends on trade with the United States has gone down since Trump's election.
Yes.
But
relative
the value
to
of companies that would in the U.S. benefit from less competition from foreign producers has not gone up in a corresponding manner.
No, what I was trying to say is that there are firms in the U.S. that would suffer if there were a trade war. Our exporters.
All right, and their value in the market has not gone down.
Has not gone down. Yeah, which is a puzzle. If you think about tariffs that are imposed and retaliated against, you would expect both U.S. and trading partner firms to lose value if they're vulnerable. And it's only happened in one direction, which suggests to me that you might have something like what's going on in China, which is, it seems to be the case that they feel that if they buy more American products, they will avoid the imposition of tariffs. And that will benefit the US economy without necessarily hurting the US exporters.
You had a post on this, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. It was a response to Paul Krugman. Yeah.
What did Krugman say? What did you say in response?
So Krugman has moved away from the New York Times. He's started his Substack now, and it's much more technical, much more wonky. And he had a post that I thought was actually quite good, where he points out that the balance of payments must balance. It's just an accounting identity. And so if you improve your trade deficit, so if there's less of a deficit with the rest of the world, it's going to affect the capital account. So the current account, which tracks trade flows and income flows, has to balance in a certain sense with the capital account, which tracks capital inflows and outflows. So people buying American stocks, bonds, real estate, that is recorded in the capital account. And when you put all this into the same ledger, which is the balance of payments, it has to balance. So, for example, if we buy more from China and Canada and Mexico than we sell to them, then they accumulate claims against us. And they will either hold US currency, but that's not much value in terms of rates of return. So they could buy US stocks, you could bonds, they could buy US real estate, US companies, and so on. So these two things balance each other. That was Krugman's point. And he was trying to argue that a reduction of capital inflows might not be a good thing for the US economy. We had trade deficits all throughout the 19th century when the US economy was growing rapidly compared to the rest of the world. And the capital inflows were fueling that growth. And I said, yes, this is one way to look at the tariffs. He was taking the tariff threats not as a negotiating tactic, but rather as something that would be implemented. And he was looking at whether or not it'll improve the trade balance. And if it did, what would be the impact on capital flows? So that's this.
And you agree that...
Yes, I agree with I agree that this is one possible scenario.
Turning on the fact that the threat of the tariff is actually carried through without anything else changing.
That's right, because Donald Trump has said that he loves the word tariffs. It's a beautiful word, and he thinks it'll be unilaterally beneficial. It's just it's not a bluff. It's not a threat. It's not it's just something that he thinks is intrinsically good. And I think that if it ends up being taken off the table in response to changes that are made overseas, the implications of that will be very different. And Krugman had not taken those into account.
The U.S. trading partners in question here are China, Canada, Mexico.
Those three are the biggest. Those three are the biggest trading partners.
What is it that they might do in response to threats of tariffs that would offset the anticipated negative consequences of the implementation of tariffs?
Buy more American products. So in the case of China, they're prepared to do it up to a point. They could buy, goods or services that will improve the U.S. trade balance, not by us importing less from them, which would happen in the case of tariffs, but rather us exporting more to them.
And the capital account effect that you identified?
That would happen. That would happen.
Indeed.
Yes, because if we export more, they will be spending more on our goods and services rather than accumulating assets, bonds, stocks, real estate, and so on, companies.
This is Paul's wheelhouse, Paul Krugman, is it not?
Completely. Yeah.
If someone asked me why was he a sole winner of the Nobel Prize in economics at a really, really young age, I wouldn't be able to tell them chapter and verse of the character of his contribution. Could you?
Well, he considered the possibility of increasing returns. So the old theory, Samuelson, Stolper, and so on, was based on comparative advantage. So the idea would be that we would export things. This is the Ricardian model, right, from David Ricardo early in the 19th century.
Hector-Olin?
Yeah, Hector-Olin is a development of basically the Ricardian model.
Two factors, two countries, two goods, neoclassical conditions.
Exactly. Now, Ricardo was different. Ricardo had different assumptions about technology, prices, and so on. But the basic idea is the same in the sense that, if you have a comparative advantage in the production of one good relative to another, you specialize in that. Your trading partner specializes in the other, and you can both benefit from trade. So the example that Ricardo used, it's a beautiful example, was cloth and wine, England and Portugal. And he made the assumption that England had an absolute advantage in both, so that they could produce both wine and cloth more cheaply than Portugal in terms of the amount of labor that it took. And despite that, if the advantage of England was greater in cloth than in wine, so it had an advantage in both, but more of an advantage in cloth, both England and Portugal could benefit by England specializing in cloth, Portugal in wine, and them trading. So that's the basic idea before Krugman. I don't want to say that it was only Krugman, but there was a puzzle. There's a puzzle with this because the US economy was exporting cars, Detroit, General Motors, Chrysler, Ford.
And importing.
And importing cars.
Right.
It doesn't make sense with the old model. Why would you do that? You either have comparative advantage in cars or you don't. And so Krugman, started to, along with others, many, many others, but he did some work that was foundational, which showed that if you have increasing returns, you can have a pattern of specialization that explains the data better. Yeah. Now, I'm not an international economist, so that's probably a very approximate description.
That's pretty good, I think. That's pretty good. So Paul Krugman has stepped away from the New York Times, and is he in retirement or?
No, I think he's very active on Substack. Yeah. Paul Krugman wonks out. That's his Substack.
I remember us having a conversation years ago in which you took the position that there should be more credit given in the academic evaluation of productivity to people's contributions to public discussion, not their specialized, technical referee journal output, so that doing something like your newsletter, Imperfect Information, and generating a wide following and taking the technical expertise to the application of, analysis of specific and interesting and important public questions, that's undervalued.
Yes, I think it should have more value than it does in decisions about promotion, tenure, and so on and so forth. There should be some space for that. In part because writing for a more general audience exposes your ideas to a certain kind of scrutiny. You can get away with assumptions, technical assumptions that might be empirically unverifiable or maybe contradicted by the data. And if you express it in plain language, you open yourself up to scrutiny in ways that can improve research. So that's one reason. But I also think that the role played by public intellectuals who bring academic expertise to a broader audience ought to have more value.
Who are among the prominent public content producers and social media contributors and bloggers writing about economics whom you'd recommend to our audience?
Krugman certainly is one. If you want a more libertarian perspective, John Cochran at the University of Chicago is very active.
He's at Stanford now, if I'm not.
Oh, he's at Stanford. I'm sorry, I must have missed that. I missed that. So he's very active. This is more of a sort of center-right, more libertarian approach, but he doesn't shy away from the technical aspects of the work. So he was involved in debates about whether lowering interest rates could actually bring inflation down. That's a very controversial proposition, but there are models that support that. So he was involved in this kind of debates, a bit esoteric maybe, but he also talks about public policy. I'm trying to think now about others in economics.
Tyler Cowen,
yeah, with Marginal Revolution. Yeah, they survey stuff. And Tyler also covers non-economics. He'll cover all kinds of things. That's what I do as well, Glenn. So some of my posts are on economics, on prediction markets, on forecasting, and so on. But I'm also interested in citizenship, in politics, in world affairs, and so on. So I just write about whatever interests me, really.
I just want to mention, since you brought up John Cochran, he has at his blog an amazing review of my memoir, Late Admissions, that was published earlier this year. Last year.
Yeah.
I was just blown away by the review. He obviously read the book carefully and
he did.
And took to it. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I mean, he has very particular ideas about how the U.S. economy should be structured with regard to Medicare, Social Security, and so on, benefits, the manner in which the government plays a role in the economy, and so on, which you may agree or disagree with. But you asked me about somebody who's writing, who's prolific, and who speaks in ways that non-experts can understand. So that's one example.
Are you following, I imagine you are, political affairs in India?
To some extent, Glenn, but at a bit of a distance. Is there anything you have in mind?
Well, I have Indian friends, of course, and people are very agitated about Modi and his party and the turn to the populist right that
Yeah.
is manifesting itself in Indian politics. I thought you might have something to say about
Yeah, I think that both India and Turkey, in similar ways, have moved away slowly but perceptibly from more secular traditions. Turkey towards Islam and India towards Hinduism. So India, at least at conception, at independence, stood in contrast to Pakistan, which was founded as an explicitly Islamic republic. Whereas, India borrowed a lot from the United States Constitution. And even patriotic songs. I was thinking about this recently. There was an Indian movie in 1943 called Kismet. And a lot of the songs from that movie, one in particular, became rallying cries in the independence movement. This is during the Second World War. Indian independence was in 1947. And these patriotic songs about independence emphasized the fact that India was populated by Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, and that there were temples and mosques and gurdwaras, the Sikh temples. And there has been this tradition also in the movie industry and so on to emphasize the very multi-religious character. Although there have been riots, there have been extreme levels of violence, and frictions have existed, violence has existed. The government itself, has moved in a direction that I think is unfortunate, to the extent that these sort of secular principles are being abandoned. Not completely, but there's some backsliding.
Yeah.
Turkey is very similar.
Have you lectured in India on you and Dan O'Flaherty's wonderful work reflected in that Harvard University Press book, Shadows of Doubt, about racial stereotypes? I mean, it's, of course, the book focused on the United States, but the issues and the ideas, it seems to me, could well be applied to, in some manner or another, to the social, political situation in India.
Yeah, so India is a very divided society historically. As you know, it's one of the countries that we used as an example when we worked on group inequality. So the divisions based on caste, based on religion now, as we just discussed. And so I have spoken about the ideas in that book. My knowledge is much more about the US situation, the US data. And of course, Dan also has worked on the US. But some of the ideas are quite general. And I've spoken with people who are interested in exploring these in the Indian context. The data is much more limited. So, for example, some of the work we did was based on victimization surveys, and those are not available to the same extent, and so on. So there's an interest in these issues, how stereotypes condition interactions between people, between strangers, that are related to crime, policing, and the justice system. But I haven't seen an obvious way to develop them in that context.
What do you make, looking here in the US, of the dramatic shift in federal policy around diversity, equity, and inclusion programming? I was amazed to read just the other day that one of the new President Trump's executive orders rescinded the executive order of President Lyndon Johnson from 1965, 11246. I've been mentioning that executive order of Lyndon Johnson's, which created the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs and set up a bureaucracy to oversee the employment patterns in federal contractors and to try to hold their feet to the fire on behalf of non-discriminatory, in terms of race and gender, employing practices of federal contractors. And that executive order has been rescinded, and it's only one of a number of such rollbacks of not just Biden. This is my point. It's not only what Biden did that is being undone. It's a more across the board rejection of the federal role in pressuring employers to engage in fair employment practices. And I wondered how you react to that, given that you've been thinking about these kind of issues for a long time.
If you read the text of that executive order from Lyndon Johnson, it's really in some ways very different from Biden's executive orders and also from the practice of affirmative action and DEI policies today. It's really very, very much about level playing field, about trying to make sure that the best candidates are hired for open positions and so on and so forth, trying to make sure it's really an anti-discrimination executive order from Johnson. So if you read the text of it, at least most of it that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
And the argument that is made, now one can debate this, the argument that is being made by the folks who want to dismantle DEI bureaucracies and infrastructure today is that it's not meritocratic. I think that's a debatable proposition. I think one can talk about that. There are nuances involved. But be that as it may, the Johnson executive order is very different in tone and content. So I was a bit surprised by that. That seems to be, the Johnson executive order seems to match the anti-DEI rhetoric, if you see what I mean.
I think that's an interesting point, and I agree with it. My own reaction is in the general direction of saying I think the Trump anti-DEI initiatives in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. You can take the position that you don't want racial preferences and you don't want reverse discrimination. And I take that position myself. I have for a long time. I'm not a big fan of affirmative action as conventionally practiced. You and I don't necessarily have the same views about that. But at the same time, you can recognize that the principles of fair employment have to be enforced. If there are discriminators out there discriminating, there needs to be mechanisms for detecting and discouraging discrimination. I mean, that's one point that I would make. Anti-discrimination is not self-enforcing, and any mechanism that you use to enforce is going to require the collection of information of the sort that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs and the rest engages in. And it's going to create incentives. I mean, if I have laws against discrimination and I can impose as a regulator costs on firms, I am creating a circumstance in which firms, in order to avoid the imposition of those costs on themselves, may engage in their own practices that are racially motivated in an interest of discouraging oversight and intervention from an anti-discrimination regulator. I don't mean to get too technical, but I just mean to say, every use of race in an employment context is not necessarily in the service of reverse discrimination or lowering of standards.
Yeah, exactly right. In fact, the Johnson executive order was motivated by exactly the opposite. It was to prevent discrimination that would be harmful to performance in order to satisfy, preferences that were bigoted or discriminatory. Now, I don't know how much the Johnson executive order mattered in terms of the actual practice of anti-discrimination enforcement. There are statutes, there are other ways in which people can use the legal system to take action, civil action, for example, against firms that discriminate. And the rescinding of that order doesn't necessarily dismantle those channels.
Yeah, that's an open question.
Yeah.
So I picked your brain about this and that. I don't know if you have anything else you want to want to kick around here before we conclude?
No, I'll just say that my last post, we talked about the book that's coming out with Polity Press, your essay, and I mentioned the afterword, but there's also a foreword that talks about how you came to write that essay, and that's interesting in its own right. So I hope people will take a look at that book.
This is forthcoming later this year from Polity Books in the United Kingdom, where Ian Malcolm is the editor in charge of this manuscript, and he solicited it from me, and I'm very happy about it. It's called Self-censorship. And it's got a wonderful cover where the title appears at the top. And then what might have been said underneath is black is ostentatiously, in an ostentatious fashion, redacted. It's a redacted cover symbolizing the content of the argument that's contained between the covers of that book, forthcoming from Polity Books later.
Yeah, it's a fantastic cover, and it takes a second to see that it's not actually a redacted version of some other cover. If you see what I mean, that it's meant.
And I have produced a foreword which frames the essay in historical terms, and yes, I'm proud of it, and an afterword which applies the argument of the essay to a contemporary case, and that's my own experience of self-censorship and talking about the Israel-Gaza conflict, which rages on as we speak, and about which I will, in the interest of maintaining self-censorship, have little more to say here today.
Fair enough.
Yeah, Rajiv.
Glad that you've spoken out on these issues.
Thank you very much. I value your friendship. I appreciate your time. My guest has been Rajiv Sethi. He's professor of economics at Columbia University, Barnard College, and also author of the Substack newsletter, Imperfect Information, which everyone who has an interest in applying economics to practical problems and policy issues should attend to. Thank you, Rajiv.
Thank you, Glenn.